What's up everyone, Master League Premier Classic will be starting later today, so you know what that means. Let's take a look at this meta and some top teams to get you ready for it. The Master League Premier Classic meta is extremely simple and small. Basically every single viable species is on this image, with a couple exceptions probably. And I would even go as far as to say that everything on the right of this dotted line is already quite niche. 99% of the Pokemon you'll see are on the left side here, and even in this graphic there are some Pokemon that might deserve a spot in the niche category instead, but we'll just leave them there for now. In general, the meta is Steel, Fairy, Dragon. They form kind of like a loop, but not really. Steel beat the Fairies obviously, the Fairies beat the Dragons, and that's where it gets interesting. The interactions between Steel and Dragon are generally kinda neutral and depends a lot on movesets. Dragonite with its new superpower has become quite a good Steel answer, though versus Magnezone it's quite bait dependent, and Metagross also still has a pretty solid matchup against it as well. But Excadrill really has a lot of trouble versus Dragonite now. If you are the Dragonite and you make sure you take a Rock Slide before you start throwing superpowers and debuffing yourself, you can actually beat Excadrill in every even shield scenario. Just straight superpower, which is just kind of ridiculous. These three dragon types, Garchomp, Como, and Haxorus, also do quite well versus steel types, especially Garchomp. When it's running Mudshot, it's an amazing answer, and even when it's running Dragon Tail, it does quite well against the steel types too, but the matchups are a little more iffy. In general though, if you're running Garchomp, Dragon Tail is the move I would recommend, just because you do better versus the opposing dragons then. Como, of course, because the fighting typing and close combat, it does quite well versus steel types too, though it does struggle a bit with Metagross, because you can't do any super effective damage there. In general though, I think Como is a bit of a worse Garchomp, so not a Pokemon I would necessarily recommend. Haxorus is quite good though, you can run with Counter, Night Slash, and Dragon Claw, which makes it quite a good steel answer, and you can still hit the opposing dragons with Dragon Claw too. Hydreigon with Brutal Swing is also a very interesting option. You beat all of the steel types in at least some even shooting scenarios. You are quite even versus the other dragons, and you have Flash Cannon, which could come in handy versus some of these fairies as a last ditch effort. It only does like 70 to 80% though, so I don't expect it to come in that useful most of the time, since you also go down in like a couple fairy fast moves. But as a last ditch effort, it could be quite epic to hit a Flash Cannon on one of these fairies, of course. If you wanna beat the dragons, the fairy types will be your best answer. These are kind of divided in two categories. The Charmers, Togekiss, Primarina, and Sylveon, which just completely destroy all the dragons based on pure fast move pressure. Which in this category, I would say Togekiss is your best bet. It just has the best stats, and once you've like charmed down a dragon, you can even hit the steel types with a super effective flamethrower, which is quite nice. But Primarina could also be interesting here, as it's the absolute hardest wall possible to Gyarados, because you resist everything it can throw at you. Another interesting thing about Primarina is that you could run it with Waterfall. It will become less good of a dragon answer, but still decent enough. But you do pick up a bit of steel matchup, especially Excadrill does not want to see a Waterfall Primarina. And, well, it can be quite a surprise as well. I ran it last time Master League Premier Classic was around as a pivot, so I would save switch into my Primarina if I had a bad lead, and I had so many Excadrill come in, expecting to see Charm, but then I would just Waterfall them down, which was super nice. Sylveon is interesting too if you're on a budget, but in general not a Charmer I'd recommend, unless you're running Double Charm, which you really shouldn't. If you're gonna run any fairy though, Florges is the one I'd recommend. With the new Fairy Wind, in addition to the moves it already had, Disarming Voice and Moonblast, it has now become an absolute force to be reckoned with. It's rank 1 on PvPo currently, which I think is definitely well deserved. It does very good versus the dragons, of course, and quite well versus the other fairies. When 2 shields up, Togekiss and Primarina will be able to fully farm you down, but get 1 shield down, and Florges beats them straight up. And they can even beat Sylveon in the 2 shield, which is just kinda wild. Besides that, it does much better versus Pokemon like Mamoswine, Walrein, and Milotic than Togekiss, and versus some of the neutral matchups, like Hippowdon for example, it also does much better when shields are down than some of these Charmers. Of course, every single fairy type will lose super hard to the steel types. There's only like 3 viable steel types: Excadrill, Magnezone, and Metagross. Excadrill is the king of the steel types, beats the other steel types quite hard, but does struggle more versus Pokemon like Dragonite, Dragontail, Garchomp, and Combo O than Metagross does. And Magnezone is quite nice because it's a really good counter to Gyarados, which is where Excadrill can really struggle. Magnezone also does fine versus Metagross, by the way, but that is kind of a winnable matchup for Metagross still, depending on baits. Snorlax is sitting in the middle here as it's one of the safest Pokemon in the meta, with Lick, Body Slam, Superpower, or even Outrage or Earthquake as a second move. It has play versus basically everything. I would say it doesn't really beat most things though. It's kind of a very neutral Pokeball that either barely wins or barely loses. Generally, it's used as one of the safest pivots in this entire meta. Really only hard countered by the fighting types, but even there, like a double Body Slam or a Body Slam plus Superpower does quite a bit of damage versus them. Then on the right here we have some of the more niche but still viable Pokemon that I'm gonna go through quite quickly right now. Evelug is a very bulky Dragon answer that also does okay versus the fairy types. It really has to watch out for the steel types, but you could consider an Earthquake to hit them still, but even then it's not great. Conkeldurr and Machamp are some of the best steel answers, but that get destroyed by the fairy types. They do have play versus all of the dragons though. Even Dragonite doesn't want to take a Rock Slide or a Stone Edge to the face, of course. Swampert, also another really good steel answer, probably the best steel answer, but gets absolutely obliterated by Dragonite, Gyarados, and it's not great versus the other dragons and the fairies either. Chestnut is very interesting. I would say Chestnut and Tangrowth are basically the same Pokemon. They are the best answer to the Excadrill Gyarados core, which is very, very common. So these are pretty niche but viable picks if you see Excadrill Gyarados core very, very often. Sneasler is pretty high ranked for no reason, I think. I think it's quite bad, actually. I put it in here just because it's high ranked, but it's extremely squishy. It's very dependent on baits. Like, PvPoke says it beats steel types, but it's all very bait dependent. You can't beat these steel types. If you miss a bait, you kind of get wrecked by the dragons. You get destroyed by the fairy types. Don't run it. Honestly, it's bad. Then Mamoswine, I think some people will be quite angry I didn't put it on the left. I definitely think it's quite strong. I just don't think it has really the stats to quite compete with the big boys just yet. But it has a nice typing. It has some nice coverage, so it's definitely extremely viable. It does quite well versus the dragons. But because of its lack of stats, it still wasn't awesome. You actually lose versus Dragonite in the one shield scenario, even if you just go straight Dragon Claw, which is stupid. But you do fine versus the steel types with Bulldoze, and the fairy types are quite even as well, so definitely a strong pick. Milotic is actually one of my favorite picks. I'm not sure if it's going to be that good anymore this season, as we're going to see way more Charmers, as everyone's going to try to beat Dragonite, of course. But yeah, Milotic with Dragontail, Surf, and Blizzard is a pretty decent answer to the dragons. Gyarados does okay versus steels besides Magnezone, and very fine versus Togekiss as well because you're running that Blizzard. However, if we're gonna see more Florges, it's just not gonna cut it anymore probably. Walrein, decent pick too, good dragon answer, has Earthquake for the steals, can hit all these fairies for neutral, and Snorlax too, but it kind of lacks the stats to really compete, but it will be quite decent. Another one of my favorites, Hippowdon, very flexible pick. You can run with Thunderfang if you want to beat Gyarados, you can run with Ice Fang, which is the most common variant to beat the dragons, and it does okay versus Steel too because of Earth power. Also has play versus the fairies, but because of its lack of stats and like good moves, these matchups are generally losing. As far as team building goes in this format, it's generally quite easy. Most top teams start with a solid core, which is a combination of two Pokemon that cover each other very, very well, and then they either combine it with a very safe pivot, like a Snorlax or a Gyarados, or they play it in an ABB style. I got a couple examples for you. For example, a very common and strong core we'll see is Dragonite plus a steel type like Extra Drill, Magnezone, and Metagross. I expect Extra Drill will be the most common here as it is the king of steels, of course. And you can play this in several different ways with a Snorlax, for example, as a very safe pivot where if you have a bad lead, you switch it to Snorlax, and if you can manage to get switch back, that's huge. Since Extra Drill and Dragonite cover each other basically perfectly, if you manage to get switch with Snorlax and align your Dragonite and Extra Drill properly, that's usually quite good. But even if you can't get switch, Snorlax might lure out an anti-steal, and if Snorlax has lured out an anti-steal, then maybe Extra Drill can still sweep the backline, even if you don't have switch. Then you could also run this in an ABB style with another steal in the back, like Metagross, where now if you get a bad lead, you switch it to one of your steals. Usually you don't even want to grab switch, then you just lure out the anti-steal, and then you hope that your other steel type in combination with the Dragonite can sweep whatever's left. Now this team is also available in a different order. You could lead Extra Drill with this as well, with Dragonite in the back, and in this case you could do Gyarados in the middle as a good pivot, or even another dragon in the middle. You know, this does make it a little bit more of a dangerous line, because Dragonite and Kommo-o can get quite hard countered, but you know, even then, you might just lure out their only dragon answer, and then your other dragon can sweep in the back. Now, this combination of Extra Drill and Dragonite is of course not perfect, but it does come close. Your best shot at beating both of them is either like your own Extra Drill, a Gyarados, or like something like a Mamoswine or Milotic do good against both as well. Another very solid core you could consider is Florges with Garchomp that cover each other quite well, as Florges of course really only struggles versus steel types, which Garchomp does beat, and Garchomp struggles very hard versus the fairy types and isn't that great versus dragons either, which Florges does quite well against. Now Garchomp's moveset, earlier in the video recommended Dragon Tail generally, but I think in this team Mudshot is probably better for the steel types, because without Mudshot, Metagross especially becomes a pretty big issue, and yeah, it can just kind of sweep Florges and Garchomp at that point, so Mudshot is definitely what I'd recommend. Though if you really prefer Dragon Tail, I think that could still work if you have a better Metagross answer in the back. One Pokemon you could run in the back here, for example, is Extra Drill. Does very well against Metagross, does very well against Fairies, which pairs quite well with these two. And in this case, you could even consider going Dragon Tail Garchomp. The problem with this squad, though, is that you don't really have a solid pivot. Everyone is gonna be prepared for Extra Drill probably, which means if you have a bad lead, let's say you lead into a Metagross, they are definitely gonna have a good answer to Extra Drill in the back, I would assume, which just isn't great. At that point, you're just gonna get rock, paper, scissors, of course, though honestly, Extra Drill also doesn't have that many hard counters. If they have like a fighter in the back or a Swampert, you're screwed. But if they have any of these Pokemon, even if a Waterfall Gyarados were to come in, you can probably, well, you can definitely take a shield there. So actually, this is probably quite a solid team. If you want something a bit safer though, I think Snorlax in the back here could work as well, or Waterfall Gyarados. Definitely don't want to go Dragon Breath Gyarados, because then you are too weak against the fairies for sure, but Waterfall Gyarados, I think you have two solid pivots to pair in the back here. This next core I'm gonna highlight will probably be one of the most common you're gonna see, because it's just so incredibly strong. Both Extra Drill and Gyarados are super flexible and solid in this meta, and they cover each other basically perfectly. You can run this duo in a lot of different ways. Basically any third here goes quite fine, but it's most commonly ran as like an ABB-ish kinda, where you have an Extra Drill lead, paired with a Gyarados pivot to lure out like Charmers, and then like a dragon in the back, most commonly Dragonite, but Garchomp, Hexorus, Kommo-o, they all really work in the back here. Another option you have is with Gyarados lead and Extra Drill in the back, and then you run either a Snorlax as a pivot, or a double steal, so Magnezone in the back, or Metagross in the back. In this case, one of your steel types will be the pivot. You try to lure out their steel answer, and once their steel answer is gone, you hope your other steel sweeps. Another option will be to run this as like an ABC line with like a Florges in the back. You just try to win the lead with Gyarados in that case, and then you hope the Extra Drill Florges core is strong enough to, you know, maybe rock, paper, scissors your opponent in the back once you've won the lead. If you want to core break these two, you really gotta go more spicy. Something like Chestnut is probably your best option since you resist everything the Exeggutor can throw and all Gyarados' charge moves. However, Chestnut just doesn't do that well versus the rest, so unless you're really targeting this, it's not a Pokemon I would recommend. The same kind of counts for Tangrowth. Milotic though might be a decent option there. It only does decent versus these two though, but at least it has more play versus the Dragons, for example. So overall, tough core to really break on paper, but in a game you can definitely play around it. If you have like your own Excadrill, you get some energy, you can really sweep both. Same counts for Dragonite or like a Snorlax, for example. So it's a good core, but you can definitely play around it. Anyway, that was it for the teams. I only showed 3 cores today, which are quite meta and boring, but that's just Master League Premier Classic. It's hard to be really creative, and these are cores I know that definitely will work. Once the meta settles a little more, you can start looking into a bit more of the spicy stuff, which I already have a couple ideas for, so stay tuned for that. But until then, I do recommend you run something more meta. Anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. See you next one. Good luck with your battle trainer.